If you or someone you love is suffering right now, then today's Cornerstone Connection is for you. My name is Nate Carter. Welcome to today's Cornerstone Connection. Today, we are in the book of Job, chapter 6. Now, I've been looking forward to this year's Old Testament readings as we get into the prophets, but that's still just a little bit ahead. Right now, we're in Job, and Job is kind of a contradiction for me. On one hand, it's a hard book to get through. It's like over 40 chapters of listening to bad advice and watching someone suffer needlessly. On the other hand, it is such an accurate portrayal of what life is like for all of us at some points, and for some of us for great periods of our life that endure suffering. And often endure suffering without knowing why, without having done anything to bring it on ourselves. So chapter 6 starts with Job speaking, and he says, "If my misery could be weighed and my troubles be put on the scales, they would outweigh all the sands of the sea." This is wonderful illustrative language here. Sand is heavy. I don't know if you've ever been to a theater production. You've seen those big set pieces that go up multiple stories high on the set. Those are being held at the bottom by big bags of sand because they're so heavy they can hold up huge set pieces. So when he's talking about the depths of his misery, he is saying, this is more than I can bear. Job is absolutely miserable. In verse 8, he says, "Oh, that I might have my request, that God would grant my desire. I wish he would crush me. I wish he would reach out his hand and kill me." He's saying, I would rather be dead. And at the same time, he's saying, I wish God would tell me why. Why has he afflicted me like this? Now, spoiler alert, we will get to the end of the book of Job. I believe it's 42 chapters. And we will not get an answer to that question of why. We'll spend 42 chapters wondering why God allowed this suffering to happen to Job. Job will ask God why it should happen, and we will get to the end, and God will not answer the question why. I appreciate one of the ways that Pastor Andy preaches during funeral sermons. One of the common refrains he comes back to is that when we see someone who's lived a good life and perhaps died young, we tend to ask ourselves why. Why would this happen to someone who was lived a righteous life like Job? Why would God allow this to happen? And Pastor Andy says the question is not a good question to ask. It's not the right question because we don't always or often get the answer to why. The better question is who. Who is the God that saves us from our sufferings? Who is the God who has a future for us where suffering will no longer be part of the equation? The question is not why, but who. It's a great thing to consider, and invite you to just kind of pause today and think about that question. Verse 14, Job says, "One should be kind to a fainting friend, but you accuse me without any fear of the Almighty." Remember, his friend Eliphaz has just spent the last couple of chapters saying, you must have done something wrong to bring on God's wrath like this. Figure it out. Figure out what you've done wrong, and then God will take away your pain and suffering. It's bad theology. It's not true. That nowhere in Scripture does it say that if you live an upright life that you're not going to have pain and suffering. It's just, in fact, we're promised pain and suffering. We should expect it. Persecution is one of the things that Jesus did promise for us in this life. In this world, you will have trouble. Verse 15, "My brothers, you have proved as unreliable as a seasonal brook that overflows its banks in the spring, when it is swollen with ice and melting snow. But when the hot weather arrives, the water disappears, the brook vanishes in the heat." In other words, Job realizes even early on in the book here that his friends are going to be worthless. They're trying to convince him that he's done something wrong. They're just spouting off words to him, and they're not helpful. And just like a seasonal brook that looks like it's going to provide refreshment to you, but then when the hot the heat hits it, the water disappears, and it doesn't provide any nourishment whatsoever. I've learned in the last few months the ministry of presence, just the ministry of a friend's presence when someone is suffering. And some pastor friends have reminded me that when a friend is suffering, often the best thing to do is just to be there, not to try to say something, not to try to fill the space with words, but rather just to be there with a friend who's suffering or who's grieving, who's in pain, whatever the case may be, just to show up, but not to try to fill it with words that like this are going to just vanish and be useless. So if you have a friend that's going through a hard time, don't feel like you've got to find the right words. Often what that person just needs to know is that you're there. Job's got the worst kind of friends. We need to learn something about that to learn how to be a good friend when someone's suffering. Now, if you're suffering, especially men, if you were at No Regrets this past weekend or 2 weekends ago, if you didn't get a chance to hear Chip Ingram speak, I implore you to get the app, the No Regrets app. It's free, and download and listen to Chip Ingram. It's called Real Life Discipleship. It's the wrong title. I wonder if he changed his message after they'd already printed all the materials, because it's really about how to go through suffering. And it was so good to hear. It's biblical. It's exactly what we need to hear. Ladies, if you're listening to this, find a guy in your life, or you can download the No Regrets app. No one's going to be checking. Listen to that, because it walks us through the book of James and how we are to approach suffering in a godly way without losing our faith. And then if you know someone who is suffering, learn how to be a good friend in those times and to provide just your presence and let your words be few. Well, suffering is an inevitable part of life that some of us will endure much of, some will endure a little of, but in either case, we need to learn how to handle it. Let's use the book of Job as a training guide to help us handle suffering well. God bless you, especially if you're going through a time of pain right now. We'll see you next time on the Cornerstone Connection.